The Tower of London, from its beginning more than 900 years ago, has been a royal palace and fortress, a stronghold guarding London and keeping safe the royal treasures and armories, as well as holding secure royal prisoners. This is reason enough to give the Tower a central place in English history, but there is more. The Tower, the most famous castle in the land, is also a symbol of majesty, power, and a living part of the national identity, a place of legend and mystery. To understand England and its history, and the English too, you have to understand the Tower.
Let's begin at the beginning. 1066. William the Conqueror began the building of the Tower after the Battle of Hastings, when he and his invading army had routed the Saxons and killed Harold, their king. William knew that to conquer England, he had to win and hold London, and so around the city, forts were built. 10 years later, one of those forts was chosen to be the site of William's great palace fortress, the Tower of London. Later on, as the castle grew and other towers were built, William's Tower became known as the White Tower, simply because the outside walls were whitewashed to make it look even more impressive.
The White Tower took 20 years to build. The 90 feet high walls are 15 feet thick at the base, narrowing to 11 feet at the top. Great quantities of material were brought to the site. Ragstone from Kent and cane limestone shipped from France. Originally, the White Tower had 3 floors. The provisions and armory were kept in the basement. The well inside the tower provided a constant supply of water, even if the garrison was under siege.
On the first floor in Norman times, the constable of the tower, who commanded the garrison, had his private apartment and official rooms. On the upper floor were the king's private apartments. This is the Great Hall. At one end would have been the throne, here the banqueting tables. Fireplaces, large enough to cook for the banquets. This is interesting, an internal lavatory or guardrobe.
St. John's Chapel is an exquisite example of Norman church architecture. But this bare stone would not have been sufficient for the Normans. It would have been plastered and painted, and in addition, there would have been a painted altar, a decorative rood screen, and stained glass windows.
It's here in the Chapel Royal that the monarchs would have worshipped on the night before their coronation procession to Westminster Abbey. Here too, young noblemen kept vigil before the new monarch made them knights to accompany him to his coronation.
For over 100 years, the White Tower served as a fortified palace. But by 1200, It could no longer accommodate the monarch and the increasing number of people who made up the court. Moreover, the defenses were inadequate against new methods of siege warfare. So the castle began to grow. The transformation of the tower was begun by Henry III. He constructed a line of walls and towers all the way around the White Tower. The Wakefield Tower was the key to the new defences on the riverfront. It was also the king's private residence and gave direct access to his new Great Chamber and Great Hall, where the public affairs of state and ceremony took place. Most of these buildings that made up the great royal palace have long since disappeared. This is the one surviving part of the palace, the Privy Chamber in the Wakefield Tower. Here Henry and his family lived. They gave private audience and worshipped. And in this same oratory is thought to be the place where a later king was murdered, Henry VI, who by legend was struck down while kneeling in prayer. In this basin, the holy vessels for the Mass were washed. These are Henry III's heraldic arms, the lions passant guardant of the House of Plantagenet, popularly known as leopards. Perhaps they're the reason the Holy Roman Emperor sent the king a present of 3 live leopards. The King of Norway gave him a polar bear, who fished for his supper in the Thames. And the King of France, not to be outdone, gave Henry an elephant, the first to be seen in England. It was Henry's son Edward I who extended the fortress even further. Beginning in 1275, he built the outer line of walls and towers and the moat beyond. The walls and towers were defended from the wall walk behind the battlements and through arrow slits within the walls and inside the towers. Behind each slit is ample room for the archer to load and shoot from several angles. See how this inner wall is higher than the outer wall. This gave the soldiers here a clear line of fire against an attacking enemy as they approached the outer wall. The gate towers protecting the entrance were especially well defended. Here at the Bywood Tower, you can see that in front and behind the folding gates were drop gates, portcullises, which could be lowered instantly. And between the outer portcullis and the gate are the murder holes, from which quicklime and missiles could be dropped on attackers and water poured down if they tried to set fire to the gates. There was a garrison then to protect the fortress. There is a garrison now. Quartered in the Waterloo Barracks are the Tower Guard, drawn from the same regiment that guards Buckingham Palace and St. James's. The Tower's mighty defences not only protected royalty, but also their treasures. And today the Tower contains some of the greatest wealth of our kingdom, the crown jewels, which have a fascinating history. After the execution of Charles I in 1649, some of the crown jewels used in the coronation were sent to the Tower Mint, where the precious metals were melted down and the priceless stones and gems were sold. However, when Charles I's son was brought back on the restoration of the monarchy, many pieces reappeared and were refashioned for his coronation. The most impressive, the most valuable, and the most beautiful crown is the Imperial State Crown, which was made for Queen Victoria in 1838. Many of the gems are of ancient origin. The Black Prince's ruby, as large as a hen's egg, was later worn by Henry V at Agincourt. The great sapphire, known as the Stuart sapphire, Elizabeth I's pearls, and the most ancient stone of all, the sapphire from the coronation ring of Edward the Confessor, who reigned before the Norman conquest. The crown worn by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, contains the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, which, according to legend, has always brought bad luck to men, never to women. The orb is surmounted by a jeweled cross to symbolize the domination of the Christian religion over the world. During the coronation ceremony, it is placed in the monarch's left hand, and in the right, the scepter with cross. At the head of the scepter is the largest diamond in the world, known as the Star of Africa. Finally, the coronation crown, called St. Edward's crown, for the lower part of this crown may date back to Edward the Confessor, the royal saint.
During Charles II's reign, the jewels were kept in the Martin Tower. They were not heavily guarded. In fact, they were kept in a cupboard and brought out for viewing if anyone was interested. This brought about one of the most bizarre incidents that ever took place in the Tower, and indeed, one of the most audacious attempts at burglary ever. Colonel Thomas Blood disguised himself as a clergyman in order to become acquainted with Talbot Edwards, the keeper of the crown jewels. Blood and his confederates knocked the keeper senseless and fled with the treasure. The alarm was raised by the keeper's son. One rogue was caught on Tower Wharf with the orb stuffed down his trousers. Another, riding off with the scepter, fell off his horse and was captured. And Blood, who had flattened the crown with a mallet and stuffed it in a bag, was also caught. Well, it would have been natural to have expected Blood to have been subjected to extreme torture and an agonizing public execution, but this was not to be. Charles II chose to try the case himself, and apparently was so amused by Blood's account of the events that he pardoned him, gave him a pension, and even made him a member of the king's bodyguard. Or did Blood, who had been a spy in the service of the king, know something to Charles's discredit?
Today, the crown jewels are heavily guarded and displayed at the western end of the Waterloo Barracks. The barracks were built on the site of the Grand Storehouse, which was destroyed in a great fire in 1841, leaving only this pediment.
Not only was the tower a royal treasury for the crown jewels, it was for some years a royal record office. It grew to such an extent that at one time both St. John's Chapel and the Wakefield Tower were filled to the ceiling with state papers, law reports, and official documents.
For 500 years, a royal mint was located between the inner and outer curtain wall. Of the 70 mints throughout England, only the Tower Mint was allowed to make gold coins, which were struck by hand until coining presses were introduced in Charles II's reign. The Royal Zoo, started by Henry III, grew over the centuries until at one time there were over 58 wild and exotic animals. The Lion Tower was aptly named, but the lions precipitated their own departure when in 1835 one of them attacked a soldier, and the constable of the tower, the Duke of Wellington, in consultation with King William IV, had the Tower Zoo closed and moved the animals to the new zoo in Regent's Park.
Throughout its history, the tower has served another major function, that of a prison. Existing records list over 2,900 names from the highest to the lowest in the land. The first English king to be imprisoned here was Richard II, before he was forced to give up the crown. But before him, there had been kings and princes of Wales, France, and Scotland, all taken prisoner in battle.
Charles, Duke of Orleans, was captured by Henry V at Agincourt in 1415 and held to ransom for 20 years. Here is the Duke being brought by boat to the Tower. Here in the White Tower, he writes a letter appealing for his ransom to be paid. He awaits news. Greets the knight who has brought the ransom and rides to freedom. On the outer curtain wall is St. Thomas's Tower, an entrance which for a long time symbolized royal displeasure.
Through Traitor's Gate passed the state prisoners of the Tudor age, and none so high and royal as the future Queen Elizabeth, dispatched here on the orders of her half-sister Mary Tudor. She stood on these steps refusing to enter and proclaimed in a loud voice, "Here landeth the truest subject, being a prisoner, that ever landed at these stairs."
She was kept in this chamber of the Bell Tower for nearly 2 months. The lieutenant of the tower would have allowed her luxuries, furniture, tapestries, rush carpets. As she was still heir to the throne, he would not have wanted to incur disfavor during her imprisonment. And if she had been executed, he would have inherited her possessions. Elizabeth took her daily exercise along this wall walk, accompanied by the lieutenant and 2 guards.
The Bloody Tower, where Sir Walter Raleigh, condemned for treason against King James I, spent 13 years. It was a fairly comfortable imprisonment. At first, Raleigh's wife and his 2 sons were allowed to join him. To make more space for them, another floor was added and a new window. Raleigh filled his days studying and writing. For the king's son, Prince Henry, he produced the first volume of his History of the World, 1,000,000 words long. But when Henry unexpectedly died, Raleigh gave up the work.
He carried out chemical experiments using herbs from his garden. Raleigh's cordial, a life-giving medicine, became famous.
Above all, he dreamed of freedom, looking out across the river, pacing up and down the ramparts outside. This is known as Raleigh's Walk. Raleigh established the first English colony in America, Virginia. Now he planned another great project of discovery, to reach the golden city of El Dorado. But the expedition was a fiasco. Raleigh, empty-handed and accused of piracy, was executed on his return.
Here in the bell tower were held two men who were later canonized, Sir Thomas More and John Fisher. Refusing to swear the oath of supremacy, recognizing Henry VIII as head of the church, was their crime. And when Henry heard that the Pope intended making Fisher a cardinal, he vowed that if the hat arrived, there would be no head for it. He kept his word, and Fisher was executed in June 1535. Unlike Raleigh, More was not allowed creature comforts, nor was he allowed the liberties of the Tower, but was kept here for 15 months in solitary confinement, in a bare, chilly room, shut up among the mice and rats. He was beheaded on Tower Hill in July 1535. Pluck up thy spirits, man, and be not afraid to do thine office. My neck is very short. Take heed, therefore, thou strike not awry for saving of thine honesty.
The harsh treatment of some prisoners was even worse than Thomas More's. They were put to the torture to force them to confess their crimes and name their accomplices. In this room, in Queen's House, Guy Fawkes was interrogated for his part in the Gunpowder Plot. Fawkes had been discovered in the cellars of the House of Lords with some of his fellow conspirators, who planned to blow up King James I and Parliament. The memorial here commemorates the discovery of the plot. Guy Fawkes was eventually put on the rack, where, not surprisingly, he disclosed the names of all his accomplices.
When taken off, he could only scrawl his first name, but later was able to sign legibly, though his hand was still somewhat shaky. Other instruments of torture are housed in the Bowyer Tower. The catchpole was used for apprehending escaping villains, the iron collar, the scold's bridle, and the scavenger's daughter, which could be tightened to crush the body into a ball to break the ribs.
Some prisoners were released, some executed, a few committed suicide, a few were murdered, some just died, and a few managed to escape. The most dramatic exit from the Tower was the Earl of Nithsdale. He was imprisoned here for his part in the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715. The night before his execution, his wife smuggled in some women's clothes, and dressed as a serving wench, he walked out of the Tower and to freedom in France.
On the other hand, this attempt at freedom failed. Here is the Welsh prince, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, falling to his death.
Private executions were carried out on Tower Green. The victim lay down, put his head on a low block, and it was cut off with an axe. The first to die was Lord Hastings. "By St. Paul," cried the future Richard III, "shrive him apace, for I will not go to dinner till his head is off." It was considered politically expedient to avoid the usual raucous crowd that gathered on Tower Hill. One victim on the green was Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, accused and found guilty of the alleged crimes of adultery, incest, and witchcraft.
I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly. And if, in my life, I did ever offend the King's grace, surely with my death I do now atone for the same. I beseech you all, good friends, to pray for the life of the king, my sovereign lord and yours, who is one of the best princes on the face of the earth, and who has always treated me so well that better could not be.
She had begged to be executed by the sword, for she feared the barbarous inaccuracy of the axe. As a kindness, Henry granted her wish, and her head was severed at the first stroke.
In 1541, the 70-year-old Countess of Salisbury refused, it is said, to put her head on the block. That did not change the order of the day. She was chased around the green by the executioner and hacked to death. The executions of the nobility took place on Tower Hill. These were great public occasions. The vast crowds would roar their approval as the executioner did his duty. Children would play, street vendors would sell their wares, and the whole spectacle took on a carnival atmosphere. This block was made for the execution of Lord Lovat in 1746. A tall block because he was an old man and stiff in the joints. His was the last public beheading on Tower Hill. Eyewitnesses report that Lovat's head was cut off with one stroke of the axe, so the other cut must have been made by a trial swing as the executioner limbered up. As Lovat climbed up onto the scaffold, he saw one of the spectator stands collapse and many people crushed to death. He laughed aloud. The more mischief, the better sport.
Since the Middle Ages, the Tower has always been a great storehouse for weapons and armor. The Royal Armouries, founded by Henry VIII, has kept pace with the changing technology of war, from longbow and musket to rifle and machine gun. But there is more. Armor and weapons were also made for sport and display. The collections were open to visitors as early as the reign of Elizabeth I, making the Royal Armouries Britain's oldest museum. In any ancient building, legends abound. The Tower is no exception. and its legends have been aided by the world's greatest playwright. Shakespeare made the tower the setting for Richard III's crimes, culminating in the murder of the little princes. The tyrannous and bloody act is done. Dighton and Forrest, whom I did suborn to do this piece of ruthless butchery, albeit they were fleshed villains, bloody dogs, melting with tenderness and mild compassion, wept like two children in their death's sad story. Oh, thus, quoth Dighton, lay the gentle babes. Thus, thus, quoth Forrest, girdling one another within their alabaster innocent arms. Their lips were 4 red roses on a stalk, which in their summer beauty kissed each other. A book of prayers on their pillow lay. We smothered the most replenished sweet work of nature, that from the prime creation ere she framed. Hence, both are gone. The 15th century had its folklore too, and in a poem by William Dunbar, we learn that Julius Caesar built the tower. And then there was Matilda Fitzwalter. She resisted King John's amorous advances. Somewhat insulted, he sent her a gift, a poisoned egg, which she ate and died. And ghosts of the tower, yes, they too are part of the mythology. There have been reported appearances of Lady Jane Grey and the Countess of Salisbury, both of whom met their end on Tower Green, and perhaps the most famous ghost of all, Anne Boleyn.
Ravens are traditionally birds of ill omen, but here in the tower, according to mythology, it is their absence that is to be feared. One popular but unlikely tradition has it that Charles II's astronomer, who for a while had his observatory at the top of the White Tower, complained that the ravens were interfering with his work. It is true that the king ordered them to be removed, only to be told that if the ravens left, the tower would fall, and with it the monarchy. A good story, and one not to be ignored. That is why the only prisoners in the tower today are the ravens, whose wings are clipped painlessly to prevent their escape. When they die, they are buried here in the Ravens' Cemetery. No prisoners have ever been so spoilt, so raucous in their protests, so loved, or so famous. The parish church of St. Peter ad Vincula has been a place of worship for the Tower residents and the general public for 900 years. An acorn which would have seeded when Christianity first came to England grew into an oak tree which, when cut down, became a main beam in the original construction of the White Tower. This wooden center of the altar cross was once part of that beam, almost 1,500 years old. The present chapel was built by Henry VIII in the early 16th century. The organ was commissioned by Charles II for Whitehall Palace and completed during the reign of William III. wooden case was carved by Grinling Gibbons. The historian Macaulay said this chapel was the saddest place in Christendom, perhaps because below the flagstones of the nave and altar lie the bodies of those executed on Tower Hill and Tower Green. Here also are buried officers of the Tower and others who lived and worked here. Sir Richard Cholmondeley, a lieutenant of the Tower, built this fine tomb for himself and his wife. It is perfect, except for one detail. It is empty. When it was opened, nothing was found but this Tudor font, hidden during the Commonwealth and protected for over 200 years. The Yeoman Warders are an institution established almost 400 years ago. But since the Tower's inception, there have always been men whose duty it is to ward or wait on prisoners and attend the gates. The daily duty roster is still called the Wait.
An old record once kept in the Tower Warders' Hall reads, on the 22nd day of August 1485, Henry, Earl of Richmond, was by public acclamation saluted on the battlefield of Bosworth, King over England, and was crowned on the 30th of October following. In the first year of his reign, the Yeoman of the Guard was first ordered, of which the Yeoman Waiters or Warders at the Tower hath the seniority.
On ceremonial occasions, this splendid body of men wear the state dress, the Tudor-style uniform of scarlet and gold. Their everyday blue uniform was introduced during Queen Victoria's reign. Often, the yeoman warders are called beefeaters, but the name properly refers not to the yeoman warders, but to the yeoman guard, the personal escort of the monarch, whose rations included a generous allowance of beef. Today, there are 42 yeoman warders, all of whom have served for at least 22 years in the Army, the Royal Air Force, or the Royal Marines as warrant officers. The day comes to an end with an ancient and private ceremony, the ceremony of the keys. The chief yeoman warder, escorted by the soldiers of the Tower Guard, formally locks the outer gates to the tower.
Escort to the keys by the center. March! Escort to the keys by the center. March!
Who comes here? The King.
Whose keys?
Queen Elizabeth King.
Pass Queen Elizabeth's keys all as well. Escort to the keys by the center. March!
Elizabeth!
The last post concludes the official day and our story. The soldiers return to barracks to prepare for the night watch of the most famous royal palace and fortress in the world, the Tower of London.
To the guardroom. Dismiss!